Hello and welcome to Mr. Block Explains Imperialism Part 1, where I'm going to go over how to build your very own empire in 7 easy steps, going over how countries and why they started to build empires using imperialism. So basically looking over the standards of ethnic interest and conflict that have contributed over the years, especially with economic and military competition among nations. So now, the steps to building an empire, I'm just going to run through these real quick because I'm going to go over them later in part 1 of the video and then part 2. So first one is that you got to centralize your government. Second, you have to industrialize your economy. Third, you have to build an army and a navy. 4, diplomacy will always win out. 5, mercantilism, mercantilism, mercantilism. Number 6, you have to change your perspective or and opinions to justify imperialism. And 7, make money. That's the end goal, just to make money. So let's start off with the first step of centralization. Now, centralization is, as we talked about earlier in this unit, is to concentrate all government and decision making to one location or group of people. For comparison, say how Germany, as y'all might remember, was split up into 300 different little states or kingdoms and principalities, and in the 39 with the Congress of Vienna, and then condensed again into and unified by Otto von Bismarck by 1871, which allowed them to become a very powerful country in comparison to where they were 40, 50 years ago before unification, where they were very divided and split up and kind of put on ends between Russia and France for the most part. So it was very big for Germany to be able to make that unification, which allows for them to be able to potentially make the steps to have an empire. Number 2, okay, build and use your own army. This is in China. We see this a lot, especially with the British, is that, being able to build an army after you industrialize your economy to be able to create mass amount of goods, especially weapons, and such, or be able to take raw materials and then take it back to your homeland and then produce them into goods that you will later turn into finished products that then sell to make a lot of money. And so we saw this happen in with the British a lot. So now the first one happened in China is they fought a series of wars called the Opium Wars, because China had a opium trade with that was fairly illegal that the British were taking advantage of and using, and the Chinese government was like, hey, like, we don't want you to keep doing this, stop coming to our ports, stop coming to opium, well, because it was a very addictive and illegal drug, and very similar to like heroin. And then the British were like, no, we're making way too much money off of this, even though it's dangerous. And a lot of times they would get even like they own like the Chinese soldiers just like hooked on it just to basically make them useless in fighting. And so they defeated the Chinese army in China, and in that process, they opened up the ports. They forced the Chinese government to give up ports to the British and allow for them to trade, when originally China was very isolationist and didn't want to trade with the rest of the world. And then we saw this happen again in South Africa, where the British and fought the Dutch, who were from the Netherlands, today's Netherlands. They fought the Dutch over parts of South Africa in the Boer Wars, and the Boers were a group of Dutch people, and they were mainly fighting about slavery. Whether it was right to have it there and also to fight over gold and diamonds, resources that are incredibly rich there that both countries were hoping to make a lot of money off of. Next step is the idea that diplomacy is always going to win out. And this is where we see that with the scramble for Africa. So Africa, for the most part, outside of the triangular trade, has been very overlooked by Europe to this point. We saw some colonization on the coast, only on the coast though, because it didn't really make sense to go into the interior and into the heart of Africa, more Central Africa and Western Africa, to be able to colonize land, because it took a lot of resources, it took a lot of men, it took a lot of time, no one was going to be there, it wasn't really worth the while. And so they mainly just traded along the coast. That's where you get like a lot of the slave trade comes from, the western part of Africa, right near the coast of the Atlantic Ocean. And however, those very quickly in the 1700s started to turn more into starting to go a little bit deeper into the interior of Africa. We see the Dutch and the British create settlements in the 1700s. The French wanted West Africa, Belgium got the Congo, which is pretty much in the center, and then America got Liberia, which is on the west coast, which actually was supposed to become a refuge for black slaves who wanted to go to Africa from the United States. It didn't really work out that way for a number of reasons. But with it though, as they were starting to go more and more into the interior, they started to change the ways that they colonized, and they started to change the ways that they made this work. So instead of just having some small control on the ports, and maybe a little bit into the coastal area, and kind of allowing for the rest of Africa to kind of be and do what it wanted to do, especially with all the groups that are there, which we'll talk about later. They started to kind of decide that well, we want to take more direct rule, we want to take more direct control, where we're actually in power, we're actually in charge, and we're controlling whole areas of land and whole countries. And very quickly, as Africa became more and more attractive, for lack of a better word, as an empire, and for the land that was needed, all the European countries were basically looking at Africa to say, hey, we want to take some part of it. And so what they did, this was about Otto von Bismarck at the Berlin Conference in 1884 to 1885, is essentially they made the birthday cake of Africa, where they basically divided up all of Africa for each nation, with small parts going to each. They basically divvied up. Britain got the most, and France got a good bit, as well as Belgium and Germany, for the most part, got the most land. So it's kind of favored to those nations who already had power, who already had wealth, who already had resources. America got Liberia, as I said already, and then the only nation that became independent and resisted colonization was Ethiopia. Italy wanted Ethiopia, but they weren't able to get Ethiopia. They had lost that war. Now, the thing about the Berlin Conference is that no African nations were invited to this conference. And a lot of nations outside of Europe were not even included or involved. And so this quickly became a European way of, well, let's just split up what parts of Africa we want. They didn't talk to African leaders. They didn't talk to any Africans in general. We'll go more into that as we go out throughout the unit. And then the biggest thing is that Europeans used very brutal tactics to be able to get what they want, especially with rubber in the Congo, in which because rubber was a sap, comes from a tree sap that's incredibly hard to harvest. You have to climb and to get out of the tree and to cut off and such, and it's very difficult. So, but Belgium realized that we can make a lot of money off of this rubber trade, and so they basically sent villagers to go out and to get the vines in the trees to get the rubber. And if they didn't bring enough, they'd be threatened with starvation and maybe chopping off limbs and death. It was incredibly just awful climate and absolutely just brutal conditions, which we're going to see more about later on in the unit. So this is part one, and we're going to stop there. And then we're going to get to part two tomorrow. I hope everybody has a good day, and let me know if you have any questions. All right, see you guys.